Cold War Explained: Ideology, Espionage, and Standoffs. When the world learned to hold its breath. It is late at night, the kind of late where the world feels quieter than it should. The streets outside are mostly empty, lit by street lamps that hum softly, like they're tired too. Somewhere a radio crackles faintly, static mixed with a distant voice, speaking about threats, borders, and freedom. Or maybe it's about loyalty, or fear, or survival. It's hard to tell. During the Cold War, it usually was. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in the year 1945. The war that was supposed to end all wars has just finished doing exactly the opposite. Europe smells like wet brick dust and burned paper. Cities lie flattened, like someone pressed them down with a giant hand. Trains crawl across shattered landscapes, carrying soldiers who survived when they probably shouldn't have, and refugees who lost everything except the ability to keep walking. And somewhere above all this rubble, two ideas are staring at each other. Not armies yet, not missiles, just ideas. On one side, capitalism, free markets, private property, the promise that anyone can make it, even if most people don't. On the other, communism, collective ownership, classless dreams, and the promise that everyone will make it, whether they like it or not. They had fought together against Nazi Germany, but now that the common enemy was gone, well, things got awkward. Because here's the uncomfortable truth no one wanted to say out loud in 1945. The Second World War didn't end with peace, it ended with exhaustion. And exhaustion has a way of turning into suspicion. Suspicion turns into fear. Fear turns into weapons. And thus began the Cold War. A war without formal declarations, without clear battlefields, without a finish line. A war where the greatest victories were invisible and the greatest defeats never officially happened. A war where everyone was terrified and pretended they weren't. The world after the fire. The aftermath of World War II didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survivors standing in the ruins, asking the same quiet question: what now? The United States emerged from the war economically powerful, geographically untouched, and deeply convinced that it had saved the world, which, to be fair, it kind of had. American factories were humming, its cities were intact, its confidence was sky high. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had paid for victory in blood. 27 million dead, entire regions burned, villages erased, and yet somehow they had pushed back the most brutal invasion in human history. The Soviets didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as survivors, as guardians, as people who learned, very painfully, that if you didn't control your borders, someone would come crashing through them with tanks. So, when Stalin looked west and saw American troops, American money, and American influence creeping across Europe, he didn't see generosity. He saw danger. And when American leaders looked east and saw Soviet troops refusing to leave Eastern Europe, installing loyal governments and talking loudly about revolution, they didn't see security. They saw expansion. Both sides were convinced they were being reasonable. Both sides were absolutely sure the other side was lying, which inconveniently they often were. Ideology, the quiet engine of fear. The Cold War wasn't just about land or power, it was about belief. Capitalism and communism weren't just economic systems, they were worldviews, moral systems, almost religions in their own way. Capitalism promised freedom, freedom to choose, to buy, to sell, to fail spectacularly. It also quietly accepted inequality as a feature, not a bug. If some people lost, well, that was unfortunate, but the system wasn't going to apologize. Communism promised equality, no classes, no exploitation, no rich men hoarding while others starved. But it demanded obedience, unity, control. Individual desires were expected to politely step aside for the greater good. Each side believed the other wasn't just wrong, but dangerous. If capitalism spread, communists feared exploitation, imperialism, and endless war. If communism spread, capitalists feared tyranny, repression, and the death of freedom itself. And here's the thing that made it worse. Both sides had evidence. Dividing the world line by line. Europe became the first great chessboard. The western half was rebuilt with American money through the Marshall Plan. Billions of dollars flowed in, rebuilding factories, stabilizing currencies, and conveniently tying Europe's future to the US economy. The eastern half was rebuilt under Soviet supervision. Governments loyal to Moscow replaced fragile democracies. Opposition parties vanished. Elections happened, technically. Results were predictable. Shockingly so. Winston Churchill famously called it the Iron Curtain. It wasn't a wall yet. It was an idea, a feeling, a slow realization that Europe was no longer one continent, but two worlds pretending to coexist. Berlin became the most awkward city on Earth, a western island deep inside Soviet territory, a place where spies, soldiers, and civilians lived shoulder to shoulder, all pretending not to notice how fragile everything was. And when the Soviets blockaded West Berlin in 1948, cutting off food and fuel, the world held its breath. The United States responded not with tanks, but with airplanes. The airlift began, planes landing every few minutes, day and night, bringing supplies to keep the city alive. It was logistical madness. It was political theater. It was a message. We're not leaving. And the Soviets backed down. No shots fired, no treaty signed, just one silent round in a war that would last decades. Espionage, the war beneath the war. If the Cold War had a heartbeat, it was espionage. Because when you can't openly fight, you spy, you listen, you steal secrets, you recruit people who feel overlooked, angry, or idealistic enough to betray their own side. Spies lived double lives, sometimes triple. They memorized false birthdays, forgot their real names, spied at neighbors they were secretly reporting on. Information became currency. Who had the bomb? Who was building one? Who was lying about having one? And when the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, years earlier than expected, the shock in Washington was visceral. Someone had talked. Someone always does. The nuclear shadow. The atomic bomb changed everything, not because it was powerful, but because it made victory meaningless. A nuclear war wouldn't produce winners, just survivors, briefly. By the early 1950s, both sides had enough weapons to destroy each other several times over. This concept got a disturbingly calm name, mutually assured destruction. MAD. Which is fitting, really. Peace was no longer maintained by trust or diplomacy, but by terror. The knowledge that pushing the button meant ending civilization, the ultimate stalemate. Children practiced duck and cover drills in schools. Families built fallout shelters. Governments made films explaining how to survive nuclear war, as if that was a normal thing to do. People learned to live with the idea that the world could end in 15 minutes, and somehow they still went to work the next morning. Korea. The Cold War turns hot. The first real test came in Korea, a country split along an arbitrary line after World War II, North supported by the Soviets and China, South supported by the United States. When North Korea invaded the South, it wasn't just a regional conflict, it was ideology with guns. The war was brutal, confusing. Cities changed hands repeatedly, millions died, and in the end, nothing really changed. The border remained, the tension froze. The war technically never ended. The Cold War had found its favorite kind of conflict: limited, deniable, endlessly repeatable. Proxy wars. Late-night reflection. By the early 1950s, the world had settled into a strange routine. No peace, no total war, just tension, endless tension. Governments spoke of freedom and security. Citizens listened to radios late at night. Spies passed messages in cafes. Missiles waited silently underground. And everyone hoped the people in charge knew what they were doing. They didn't always, but that realization would come later. For now, the Cold War was only beginning. The shadows were growing longer, and the world was learning how to live without ever truly relaxing again. Fear comes home. What happens when that held breath starts to hurt? Because eventually, fear doesn't stay at the borders. It comes home. It sits at the dinner table. It watches television with you. It asks uncomfortable questions and expects answers. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had seeped into everyday life, not with explosions or invasions, but with suspicion, with whispers, with the quiet understanding that the enemy might not be over there anymore. It might be next door. The Red Scare, paranoia in a necktie. In the United States, fear took on a distinctly American flavor. It wore suits, it carried folders, it spoke confidently into microphones. His name was Joseph McCarthy, and he claimed very loudly that communists were everywhere. In the government, in Hollywood, in universities, possibly in your toaster if you weren't careful. McCarthy never really proved much. He didn't need to. Fear did the heavy lifting for him. The idea that America could rot from the inside was terrifying enough. Committees were formed, hearings were televised, careers ended in minutes. Writers, actors, teachers, people whose only crime was thinking slightly too differently were blacklisted, fired, publicly humiliated. And the irony, of course, was exquisite. In trying to defend freedom, America flirted dangerously with repression. Because of course it did. People learned to watch what they said, to keep opinions vague, to laugh at jokes they didn't find funny. Loyalty wasn't something you felt, it was something you performed. And somewhere in the background, the Soviet Union watched with quiet satisfaction. China, when half the world tilts. While America was busy interrogating itself, the world changed dramatically somewhere else. China fell to communism. In 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop Tiananmen Gate and proclaimed the birth of the People's Republic of China. A quarter of humanity had just stepped into the communist camp. In Washington, this landed like a punch to the stomach. How did we lose China? Politicians demanded, as if countries were misplaced keys. The truth was complicated. Civil war, corruption, peasant support, nationalism. History doing what history always does, ignoring neat explanations. But nuance doesn't survive panic. The Cold War suddenly wasn't just East versus West, it was global. Asia mattered now, Africa would matter soon, Latin America was already being nervously watched. Every revolution became suspect, every protest looked like a potential domino. And once you believe in dominoes, you start pushing back hard. The CIA and the art of invisible power. If the Cold War had a public face, it was speeches and parades. Its private face was the CIA. Founded in 1947, the CIA was designed to do the things governments preferred not to talk about: overthrow governments, manipulate elections, spread propaganda, make problems disappear quietly. In Iran, 1953, the CIA helped overthrow a democratically elected prime minister who had dared to nationalize oil. In Guatemala, 1954, a similar story unfolded. Leaders deemed too left-leaning were replaced with friendlier regimes. Friendly to American interests, anyway. These operations were clean on paper, messy in reality. They planted seeds of resentment that would grow for decades. But at the time, they felt necessary, because the alternative, doing nothing, felt worse. And somewhere in Moscow, the KGB was doing much the same, funding sympathetic movements, crushing dissent, perfecting surveillance to an art form. Two invisible hands shaping the world, neither admitting it, both insisting they were the good guys. Everyday life under the shadow.
For ordinary people, the Cold War wasn't always dramatic. Often it was boring and tense and quietly absurd. In America, families built bomb shelters stocked with canned food and board games, because if the world ended, at least you'd have Monopoly. In the Soviet Union, citizens navigated a system where the wrong joke could ruin your life, where neighbors listened too closely, where letters were opened, phones tapped. Both sides told their citizens the same thing, just phrased differently. We are protecting you. They are lying to you. Television became a battlefield. Movies portrayed villains with thick accents and moral ambiguity carefully removed. Comics warned children about subversion. Even architecture reflected ideology. Glass and steel versus concrete and control. And yet, life went on. People fell in love, went to school, argued about sports. History has a way of unfolding while people are busy living. Nuclear arms and sleepless generals. Behind closed doors, military planners lost sleep. The arms race accelerated. Bigger bombs, faster missiles, submarines that could hide beneath oceans with enough firepower to end cities they would never see. Generals talked calmly about megadeaths. Politicians debated acceptable losses. This was the most dangerous part of the Cold War, not the hatred, but the normalization, the way annihilation became a statistic. And still, no one pushed the button. Not yet, because fear cuts both ways, and survival has a way of encouraging restraint, at least most of the time. A world dividing further. By the mid-1950s, alliances hardened. NATO on one side, the Warsaw Pact on the other. The world wasn't just divided, it was organized, militarized, categorized. Neutrality became suspicious. Non-alignment became a tightrope walk. New nations emerging from colonial rule were courted aggressively. Aid came with conditions. Friendship came with expectations. The Cold War didn't ask permission, it simply arrived. Late-night pause. By now, the rules were clear. You didn't fight directly. You didn't trust openly. You didn't relax. The Cold War had become a permanent state of mind, a quiet, grinding pressure. Like living next to a fault line you know will move eventually. You just don't know when. And somewhere, in the background, a small island nation called Cuba was drifting closer to the center of the storm, which, as it turns out, was about to matter a great deal. Missiles, walls, and the edge of the world. There comes a moment in every long, unresolved argument when the voices drop. Not because things are calm, but because everyone is suddenly aware of how far they've gone. By the late 1950s, the Cold War had reached that moment. The shouting was over. The speeches had been made. The alliances were locked in place. Now came the staring contest. Berlin, a city holding two futures. Berlin was never meant to last like this. A city split down the middle, surrounded by ideological enemies, humming with tension like an exposed wire. It was a place where history refused to choose a single direction. On one side, West Berlin glittered. Neon signs, jazz clubs, supermarkets full of things you didn't technically need but very much wanted. It wasn't perfect, but it was loud, alive, and deliberately visible. On the other side, East Berlin stood gray and watchful. Streets were quieter, buildings heavier. Posters reminded citizens of duty, sacrifice, and vigilance. The future was promised, but it never quite arrived. People voted with their feet. By the hundreds of thousands, East Germans slipped into the West. Students, workers, doctors, entire families disappearing overnight. For the Soviet-backed government, this wasn't just embarrassing, it was existential. A system that people had to escape from wasn't winning the argument. So, in August of 1961, under the cover of darkness, they acted. Barbed wire first, concrete next, watchtowers after that. By morning, Berlin was cut in two. The Berlin Wall wasn't just a barrier, it was an admission, a physical confession that ideology alone wasn't enough. You needed concrete, guns, and orders to shoot. The West called it a prison wall. The East called it an anti-fascist protective barrier. Both sides pretended this was normal. Khrushchev and Kennedy, two men, one planet. Leadership matters, especially when the stakes include the survival of the species. In the early 1960s, the Cold War was shaped by two very different men. Khrushchev was loud, impulsive, and deeply insecure about Soviet power. He liked dramatic gestures. He banged shoes on desks. He smiled broadly while threatening destruction. Kennedy was young, polished, and painfully aware of how little room for error existed. He inherited a Cold War already simmering and was expected to manage it gracefully. Their first meeting in Vienna in 1961 was not great. Khrushchev pushed. Kennedy hesitated. Both walked away convinced the other might be dangerous, which, in hindsight, was accurate. Cuba. A revolution finds a sponsor. Cuba had long been America's playground. Casinos, sugar, beaches, a friendly dictator who knew where his support came from. Then came Fidel Castro. In 1959, his revolution toppled the old regime. At first, the United States wasn't sure what to make of him. A nationalist, a reformer, just another revolutionary with a beard and big ideas. Then he started nationalizing American businesses. That cleared things up. The US pushed Castro away. The Soviets welcomed him. A small island 90 miles from Florida drifted firmly into the communist orbit. And suddenly, the Cold War wasn't an abstract thing happening over there. It was offshore. The Bay of Pigs, when plans go quietly wrong. In 1961, the CIA attempted to remove Castro. The plan was simple, which should have been a warning. Exiled Cuban fighters would land at the Bay of Pigs. The population would rise up. Castro would fall. Everyone would go home satisfied. None of that happened. The invasion collapsed almost immediately. The rebels were captured. The US was humiliated. Castro was strengthened. And the message to the Soviet Union was unmistakable. America was willing to act, and sometimes it failed. That made things more dangerous. Missiles in the night. In October 1962, American spy planes flying over Cuba saw something strange. Long objects, unmistakable shapes, missile sites. Soviet nuclear missiles were being installed just miles from US shores. This was not subtle. This was not defensive. This was a direct challenge. For 13 days, the world balanced on the edge. Kennedy convened meetings behind closed doors. Military leaders urged airstrikes, invasions, decisive action. Khrushchev waited, watching American ships move closer, forming a naval blockade, politely called a quarantine, because words matter when nukes are involved. Messages crossed the Atlantic slowly, carefully, sometimes confusingly. At one point, 2 different letters arrived from Khrushchev, one conciliatory, one aggressive. No one was entirely sure which one to answer. Meanwhile, Soviet submarines carrying nuclear weapons were being harassed underwater. One nearly launched its torpedo, convinced war had already begun. It took a single officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refusing to give consent. One man, one decision, one planet saved. Eventually, a deal was struck. The Soviets would remove the missiles from Cuba. The US would secretly remove its missiles from Turkey. Both sides declared victory. What they really felt was relief. After the brink. The Cold War changed everything. Not publicly, quietly. A direct hotline was installed between Washington and Moscow. Not for friendship, just clarity. When the world might end in minutes, misunderstandings were unacceptable. Both sides stepped back, just a little. They signed arms control agreements, talked about limits, acknowledged, without saying it, that this couldn't keep escalating forever. But the Cold War didn't end. It just learned how close it had come. Walls, wars, and waiting. Elsewhere, the conflict continued. Vietnam simmered. Africa became a battleground of influence. Latin America remained unstable. The Berlin Wall stood firm. Families waved across it, sometimes for decades. And the nuclear weapons kept multiplying. Smaller, faster, more precise. Because if you're going to end the world, efficiency matters. Late night stillness. By the mid-1960s, humanity had survived its closest call. People went back to their routines. Children grew up practicing drills they hoped they'd never use. Leaders learned to smile carefully. The Cold War had proven something essential. The end of the world wasn't inevitable, but it was always possible. And that knowledge never quite goes away. Still, history moves forward. New leaders rise. Old certainties crack. And in the next chapter of this long night, the Cold War would shift again. Less explosive, perhaps, but no less dangerous.
Détente, decline, and the quiet collapse. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that follows surviving something terrible. Not relief, not joy, just a deep, bone-level tiredness. By the late 1960s, the Cold War had reached that stage. The missiles were still there. The walls were still standing. The spies were still spying. But the constant edge, the sense that tomorrow might simply not exist, had softened. Not disappeared, just dulled, like a blade used too often. The world hadn't become safer. It had become cautious. Détente, when enemies learn to speak softly. They called it détente, a French word because of course it was. It sounded elegant, civilized, like something discussed over wine rather than war plans. Détente meant easing tensions, talking instead of threatening, signing treaties instead of building more bombs. The United States and the Soviet Union began to negotiate limits on nuclear weapons, SALT treaties, arms caps, agreements to not push things too far. It wasn't trust, it was recognition. Recognition that endless escalation was unsustainable. Recognition that even superpowers had limits, economic, political, psychological. Leaders still smiled for the cameras, still spoke of strength, but behind closed doors the tone was different. Careful, measured, almost human. For a moment, it felt like the Cold War might mellow into something manageable. History, of course, had other plans. Vietnam, the war that wouldn't stay quiet. If détente was the attempt at calm, Vietnam was the reminder that the Cold War was still very much alive. What began as a colonial struggle turned into a grinding proxy war. North Vietnam backed by communists, South Vietnam backed by the United States. It was supposed to be contained. It wasn't. American troops poured in. Bombs fell relentlessly. Jungles burned. Villages disappeared. And for the first time, the war came home in real time. Television showed the fighting, the casualties, the confusion. People watched the Cold War bleed. Protests erupted. Trust in government eroded. Questions that had been whispered became shouted. What were they fighting for? Was this really about freedom? And if so, whose? When the US finally withdrew in the 1970s, it wasn't victory or defeat that lingered. It was disillusionment. The Cold War promised clarity, good versus evil. Vietnam offered only doubt. The Soviet system, cracks in the concrete. From the outside, the Soviet Union looked solid. Big parades, tall missiles, rigid discipline. Inside, things were less impressive. The plant economy struggled to keep up with reality. Factories met quotas by producing unusable goods. Innovation lagged. Corruption quietly flourished. People adapted. They always do. They traded favors, collected connections, learned which rules mattered and which didn't. But beneath the routines, stagnation set in. A system built on certainty found itself unable to change.
A government obsessed with control struggled to inspire, and the gap between propaganda and lived experience grew wider every year. The arms race that wouldn't stop. Even as leaders talked peace, the weapons kept coming. Intercontinental missiles, nuclear submarines, warheads small enough to be usable, which is a deeply unsettling word when paired with nuclear. Each side justified it the same way. We don't want to use them, but what if they do? Fear doesn't disappear just because it's expensive, and the Cold War economy thrived on fear. Afghanistan, the Soviet Vietnam. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Officially, it was to support a friendly government. Unofficially, it was a disaster. The war dragged on. Guerrilla fighters resisted fiercely. Terrain swallowed armies. Morale collapsed. The United States saw opportunity. Weapons flowed. Money followed. The conflict became yet another proxy war, one that bled the Soviet Union economically and psychologically. Sound familiar? History has a dark sense of humor. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was tired, not defeated, just worn thin, like something held together by habit rather than belief. Reagan, rhetoric, and reality. In the United States, Ronald Reagan took office with bold language. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire, promised renewed strength, pushed massive military spending. It sounded like escalation, but something else was happening too. Behind the rhetoric, conversations continued. Arms talks resumed. Channels remained open. Even in the Cold War, theater mattered. Sometimes strength was something you performed so you could negotiate from a position of confidence. Gorbachev, the man who changed the ending. And then came Mikhail Gorbachev. He didn't look like previous Soviet leaders, younger, softer spoken, less rigid. He introduced new words into the Soviet vocabulary: glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring. They were meant to save the system. They ended it. By loosening control, Gorbachev exposed problems that could no longer be hidden. People spoke more freely, criticized openly, demanded more. Eastern Europe watched closely. And then, quietly at first, things began to unravel. The fall of the wall. In 1989, crowds gathered in Berlin. Confused announcements, unclear orders, guards unsure what to do. And suddenly, the wall was no longer untouchable. People climbed it, chipped it apart, stood on top of it, laughing, crying, disbelieving. No tanks rolled in, no shots were fired. After decades of tension, the Cold War's most iconic symbol fell, almost accidentally. History doesn't always end with explosions. Sometimes it just gives up. The end without a bang. By 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. Flags came down, new borders appeared, old certainties vanished. There was no final battle, no surrender ceremony, no victory parade, just a quiet acknowledgement that the long standoff was over. The Cold War ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Late-night reflection. The Cold War lasted nearly half a century. It shaped governments, defined generations, taught humanity how close it could come to ending itself and step back. It left scars and habits and weapons that still exist. And perhaps its greatest lesson is the simplest, that fear can organize the world, but it can't sustain it forever. Eventually, even the longest night gives way to morning, not because everything is fixed, but because people decide they are too tired to keep fighting the same invisible war. And somewhere, long after the speeches and treaties, ordinary people sleep, under a quieter sky, hoping they never have to practice ducking under desks again.